She defended a young Apache when deputies beat him. Then 176 Apache showed up at her cabin. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. The day began like any other. It was late spring, and the sun shone down on the small, dusty town of Ridgewood, nestled deep in the heart of the American Southwest. A gentle breeze rustled the dry, yellow grass as the town's few residents went about their daily routines. In a small cabin just on the outskirts, Sarah, a quiet, independent woman in her 30s, was tending to her garden. Sarah had lived in Ridgewood for years, far removed from the bustling town center, preferring the peace and solitude of the countryside. She was known to the locals as someone who kept to herself, always offering help when asked, but never too eager to join in the town's gossip. That morning, as Sarah worked in her garden, she heard a commotion coming from the direction of the town square. The sound of shouting voices, followed by the unmistakable crack of a wooden staff, caught her attention. Her instincts told her something was wrong, and without thinking, she grabbed her shawl and hurried towards the noise. When she arrived at the square, the scene that unfolded before her was one she could never have anticipated. A group of local deputies had surrounded a young Apache boy, no older than 16, who had been accused of stealing from one of the townspeople. The boy, frail and covered in dirt, was kneeling on the ground, his hands bound behind him. The deputies, their faces twisted with anger, were shouting at him, each one taking turns striking him with their heavy wooden staffs. The boy flinched with every blow, his body trembling with fear and pain. Sarah's heart sank as she watched the injustice unfold before her. She had known the boy for a few years. He was part of a nearby Apache tribe, and while the town had a complicated history with the natives, Sarah had never held the same prejudices. She had seen this boy help his people with their harvest, and even helped her once when her cattle wandered onto their land. This was not the boy she knew. This was a child caught in a system that judged him before he could explain himself. Without thinking, Sarah rushed forward, her footsteps barely making a sound on the dusty ground. She approached the deputies, her voice calm but firm as she called out, "Stop! This is enough. You have no right to treat him like this." The deputies turned to her, their faces filled with surprise and irritation. One of them, a stocky man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. "Stay out of this, Sarah. This is none of your business," he growled. But Sarah didn't back down. She stepped between the boy and the deputies, holding her hands up in a sign of peace. "You don't understand. He is just a boy, and you are hurting him for nothing. He deserves a chance to explain himself, not this cruelty." The deputy with the scar smirked. "You think you can stop us? This is our town, and we make the rules here. Get out of the way, or you'll be next." Sarah stood her ground, her eyes locked on his. "I will not let this happen. You will not harm him anymore." The air between them thickened with tension, but Sarah didn't flinch. She knew that if she didn't act now, this boy's life would be ruined forever. The other deputies hesitated, looking at each other unsure of how to proceed. The scene was escalating, and Sarah knew something had to give. With a deep breath, she finally spoke. "If you have any decency, you'll let him go. He has done nothing wrong." Just as she finished speaking, a loud rumble of hooves broke the tense silence. From the horizon, a group of figures appeared on horseback, their presence immediate and powerful. Sarah's eyes widened as she recognized the riders. They were Apache, and there were many of them, more than she could count. One by one, they dismounted and walked toward her, their faces serious and determined. She had never seen so many Apache in one place before. The lead rider, a tall man with silver-streaked hair and a stern expression, approached Sarah. Without saying a word, he placed a hand on her shoulder in a gesture of solidarity. The deputies, now realizing the gravity of the situation, took a step back. The boy, who had been silent the entire time, looked up at the approaching riders, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and gratitude. It was then that Sarah understood. These Apache warriors were not here to fight. They were here to protect. The boy was not just any Apache child. He was a part of their tribe, and his life had value. Sarah had unknowingly become part of a much larger story, one where justice would be served in ways no one in Ridgewood could have imagined. Little did she know, this was only the beginning of something much bigger than any of them. The moment the Apache warriors dismounted, the atmosphere shifted. The deputies, who had once been so sure of their authority, stood frozen, unsure of how to react. Sarah's heart raced as she looked at the imposing figures who now filled the square. The tall leader with the silver-streaked hair was the first to speak, his voice calm, but carrying an air of undeniable power. "You have no right to harm him," the leader said, his eyes fixed on the boy who had been so brutally treated moments ago. The deputies took a step back, and Sarah could feel the tension in the air, thick with anticipation. She knew that what was happening now was far from over. It was just the beginning of something that would change the course of her life, and the life of the young Apache boy who had been her unintended cause. The leader of the Apache warriors turned to Sarah, his expression softening. "We have heard of your actions, your courage," he said. "You have protected one of our own. For that, we are grateful." Sarah, still shaken by the events that had unfolded, nodded, unsure of what to say. Her mind raced, trying to process everything. These warriors were not here to punish, but to show gratitude. She had never imagined that her small act of kindness would lead to such an overwhelming show of support. The warriors stood silently, their eyes scanning the area, waiting for further instructions. Sarah, however, felt a deep sense of responsibility settle over her. She realized that, in some way, her actions had led to this moment, and now she had a choice to make. She could either remain a passive observer, or she could stand alongside these warriors and face the consequences of what had just transpired. One of the warriors, a young man with sharp eyes and a strong build, stepped forward and knelt before Sarah. "We are not here to seek vengeance," he said, his voice steady. "But we will not allow one of our own to be treated like this again. You have defended him, and now we stand with you." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She could feel the weight of their words, and she realized just how serious this situation had become. The warriors were not just protecting the boy, they were offering their protection to her as well. This was no longer just about a young Apache child. It was about a woman who had defied the law to do what was right. The air hung heavy with the weight of their offer, and Sarah took a deep breath, looking at each of the warriors before her. She could feel the eyes of the deputies on her, watching, waiting for her next move. She was no longer just a bystander. She was part of something much larger than herself. "I can't ask for your protection," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I will stand with you. I will not let this happen to another child." The leader nodded approvingly, a faint smile appearing on his weathered face. "Then you are one of us now," he said. "And we will stand with you, no matter the cost." As the warriors began to form a protective circle around Sarah and the young Apache boy, the deputies exchanged uncertain glances. They had never encountered a situation like this before, where the power of a community outweighed the authority of the law. But they also knew that they could not fight the strength of the Apache warriors who had arrived. The leader's eyes remained fixed on Sarah, his gaze filled with understanding and respect. "This is only the beginning," he said. "There are many more who will come, and we will fight for justice, not just for this boy, but for all of us." Sarah nodded, feeling a sense of resolve settle deep within her. She had stepped into something far greater than she had ever anticipated, but now she knew that there was no turning back. The boy, who had remained silent through it all, looked up at her with a mix of gratitude and awe. He had seen the warriors arrive, and he knew that his life had just changed forever. But it was more than that. His fate, and the fate of his people, was now intertwined with Sarah's. The events that had just unfolded were only the beginning of a much larger story, one that would see the balance of power shift and the voices of the oppressed finally heard. As Sarah stood with the Apache warriors, her heart swelled with a mix of fear and hope. She had done something small, something right, and it had led to this moment of unity. She wasn't alone anymore. Together, they would fight for justice, and for a future where no one had to live in fear. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the land. The warriors stood tall, their faces etched with determination. Sarah, standing among them, knew that the battle for justice was just beginning, but it was a battle she was no longer afraid to fight. As the days passed, Sarah's life slowly began to change. The Apache warriors, now a constant presence in Ridgewood, stood as a reminder to the townsfolk of what had happened. The streets, once quiet, now hummed with the tension of a town unsure of what to do with the Apache's sudden arrival. The local sheriff and deputies, though still reluctant to confront the warriors directly, had been forced to acknowledge their power. They kept their distance, their once stern faces now hesitant as they avoided crossing paths with Sarah or the Apache tribe. Sarah, however, wasn't afraid. She had done what she knew to be right, and despite the overwhelming odds, she had stood firm. Each day, she would find herself standing on the porch of her small cabin, gazing out at the warriors as they patrolled the land. They had become part of her life now, their silent, watchful presence reminding her of the bond they shared. But the peace they had brought wasn't one that would last. Word had spread beyond Ridgewood, and soon the rumors of what had transpired reached other towns. The Apache tribe, once seen as a threat, was now becoming something different. They were becoming protectors, defenders of those who had been wronged. But with the passing of each day, the tension in the air grew thicker. It wasn't long before the first true challenge would come. One afternoon, as Sarah was tending to her garden, a figure appeared on the horizon. A rider, dressed in the dark, dusty uniform of a lawman, approached her cabin. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know what to expect, but she had a sinking feeling that whatever it was, it wouldn't be good. The rider dismounted as he reached the edge of her porch, his eyes scanning the area. Sarah stood up straight, her hands still covered in soil, her face betraying nothing. The man stepped forward, tipping his hat to her. "Ma'am, I've come to speak with you," he said, his voice low and cautious. Sarah nodded, motioning for him to continue. The man's eyes shifted to the warriors, standing nearby, watching with silent, piercing gazes. "You've caused quite a stir around here," he continued. "I'm not sure how things work in your world, but in ours, this kind of action doesn't go unnoticed." Sarah's brow furrowed, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. The man continued. "The sheriff wants to make sure that everything is handled properly. These Apache warriors are no different from the rest of them. They've come here looking for something, and I'm afraid that something isn't what we want in this town." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. She had known this day would come. There was no way the town could let things stand as they were. The sheriff and the others would soon make their move, but she was determined to stand her ground. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice steady. The rider shifted uneasily, clearly not used to being questioned. "We want peace, ma'am," he said. "But peace isn't going to come if these people stay here. We can't let them take over the town." Sarah's gaze narrowed. "They're not taking over anything," she said firmly. "They're here to protect, to make sure that people like the boy who was beaten don't suffer anymore. This is what's right." The man stood silent for a moment, looking at her, trying to read her. "You've made your choice," he said finally. "But I'm afraid you're going to regret it. This town is under my jurisdiction, and I can promise you, it's not going to go the way you think." Sarah's heart sank. She knew what was coming, but she wasn't about to back down now. As the rider turned and began to walk back toward his horse, Sarah could feel the weight of the situation settling on her shoulders. The Apache warriors had made their presence known, and now, Ridgewood was on the brink of something much larger. The balance of power was shifting, and there was no turning back. The rider's warning echoed in her mind, but Sarah was resolute. The fight for justice, for what was right, was only just beginning, and she wouldn't be the one to turn away. As the man rode off into the distance, Sarah turned back to the warriors who had been standing silently by her cabin. Their leader, the tall man with the silver-streaked hair, approached her. "You've made a stand," he said quietly, "and we will stand with you." Sarah nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer alone. The Apache warriors were her allies, and together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the land. Sarah stood tall, watching as the warriors began to prepare for whatever was coming. The quiet strength of their presence filled her with a sense of purpose. This was the moment that would define them all. As Sarah stood in the doorway of her cabin, watching the last of the riders disappear over the horizon, she felt a strange mix of fear and determination settle over her. The warning from the rider echoed in her mind, but she knew that the course she had chosen was the only one she could follow. The Apache warriors had come to her aid, and they had become more than just protectors. They were her allies, and she could not turn her back on them now. The next morning, the air was thick with tension. Sarah had heard rumors through the town, whispers of what was to come, and she knew that the showdown she had been dreading was drawing near. The sheriff had gathered a group of men, deputies, and volunteers alike, and they were planning to confront the Apache warriors. Sarah could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her as she stood by the window, watching the warriors move about their camp. The tall leader with the silver streaks in his hair, who had become a constant presence in her life, noticed her watching and walked over to her. "You are not afraid?" he asked, his deep voice carrying a hint of curiosity. Sarah turned to face him, her heart steady despite the growing sense of dread. "I'm not afraid of what's coming," she said, her voice resolute. "But I'm afraid of what will happen if we don't stand firm. I can't let them do this to you, or to any of us." The leader nodded, a flicker of approval in his eyes. "Then we will stand together," he said. Sarah could see the conviction in his face, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. They were in this together, and that made all the difference. The day passed slowly, the anticipation growing with every hour. As evening approached, Sarah saw the familiar dust cloud rising from the road leading into town. It was the sheriff and his men, a small but determined group, riding toward the cabin. Sarah knew that this would be the moment where everything would change. She stepped outside to meet them, standing tall and unyielding as they rode up. The sheriff dismounted, his face tight with anger. "This is your last chance, Sarah," he said, his voice cold. "You need to tell your Apache friends to leave. They have no place here. This town will not be controlled by them." Sarah's eyes narrowed, but she held her ground. "I'm not telling them anything," she said firmly. "You don't control this town, Sheriff. You've never had the right to do so." The sheriff's eyes flicked to the warriors standing at the edges of the clearing, their stoic expressions unreadable. His gaze hardened. "You're making a mistake. You think these people will protect you, but they'll be gone when things get tough. And when they're gone, we'll still be here, and you'll have to face the consequences of your actions." Sarah felt a surge of anger rise within her, but she held it in check. She had heard this kind of talk before, from men who had no understanding of what it meant to be truly free, truly just. "I'm not afraid of your threats," she said, her voice steady. "And I'm not afraid of you. You're not the law here. The law is about what's right, and I'm standing with them. With my people." The sheriff's face twisted with fury, but before he could respond, the leader of the Apache warriors stepped forward, his tall frame towering over the sheriff. "You are the one who is mistaken," he said calmly, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "We did not come here to take over. We came here to protect, and we will not be moved." The sheriff took a step back, his hand resting on his holster, but he didn't draw his weapon. For a moment, there was only silence, broken only by the rustle of wind through the trees. Sarah felt the weight of the moment settle heavily over her. She knew what was at stake. If the sheriff and his men attacked, there would be no turning back. The Apache warriors were not here to fight unless they were forced to, but they would not back down. "This is your final warning," the sheriff said, his voice low and dangerous. "Leave now, and there won't be bloodshed. But if you don't, there will be bloodshed." The Apache leader finished for him, his tone calm but firm. "If you threaten us, we will defend ourselves." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't flinch. The sheriff's eyes flicked from her to the warriors, and for a long moment, the two sides stood facing each other. The weight of their stare seemed to stretch for an eternity. Finally, the sheriff seemed to come to some decision. He turned on his heel and motioned for his men to follow. "This isn't over," he muttered. "We'll be back." Sarah watched them leave, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She had held her ground, but the real battle was still ahead. As the dust settled and the warriors returned to their camp, Sarah felt a strange sense of relief. They had won this round, but she knew that there was still much more to come. This was only the beginning, and the fight for justice, for the freedom of the Apache people, had just begun. As Sarah stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the dust settle from the departure of the sheriff and his men, she felt a sense of unease. The standoff had ended without bloodshed, but she knew this fragile peace wouldn't last long. The Apache warriors, their faces stoic and unyielding, returned to their camp as if nothing had changed. Yet, Sarah could feel it in her bones. The storm was coming. The sheriff's threat still echoed in her mind. They would be back. She could feel the weight of their hostility pressing down on her, but she didn't let it show. She had made her stand, and she would not back down. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the orange glow bathed the landscape, Sarah found herself in deep conversation with the leader of the Apache warriors. His name was Dakota, and though his face was lined with the wisdom of years, there was a warmth in his voice that made Sarah feel like she wasn't alone anymore. "Sarah," Dakota began, his deep voice steady, "the time is coming when you will have to choose between standing with us and standing with them. This is no longer just about the boy you defended. This is about something much bigger." Sarah nodded, her heart heavy with the burden of what he was saying. She had known that this wasn't just about one boy, but it was hard to truly understand how deep the conflict ran. "I won't turn my back on you," she said quietly, "but I don't know if I can stand against the entire town." Dakota studied her for a moment, as if weighing her words. "You've already chosen, Sarah. You chose when you stood between the boy and the deputies. Your actions speak louder than words." The warriors gathered around their campfire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. They were a formidable group, men and women, young and old, each with a purpose, each with a story. Dakota had led them with honor and strength, and now they were ready to fight for their place in this world. But not without reason, not without justice. As the fire crackled, Sarah realized that what they were fighting for wasn't just their right to live in peace. It was their right to be seen as equals, to be heard. For too long, they had been pushed to the margins of society, their voices drowned out by those in power. Now, they were here to make sure that didn't happen again. The next morning, Sarah woke to the sound of distant hooves approaching. Her heart skipped a beat as she stepped outside, her eyes scanning the horizon. The riders were back, but this time, there were more of them. A large group of men, dressed in the same dusty uniforms as the sheriff's men, appeared in the distance. They rode with purpose, their faces hard and determined. Sarah's stomach tightened. This was it. The time had come. She stepped forward, her hand resting on the hilt of the small knife she kept by her side. Dakota was by her side in an instant, his expression unreadable. "Stay calm," he said quietly. "They are here to test us. We will not strike first, but we will not run either." The riders pulled up in front of the cabin, their eyes scanning the land with suspicion. The leader of the group, a tall man with a weathered face, dismounted and approached Sarah. He was the sheriff. His eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. "You've caused enough trouble, Sarah," he said, his voice cold. "These people don't belong here. You've stirred up something you can't control." Sarah stood tall, her chin lifted in defiance. "I didn't stir anything up," she replied. "I simply defended what was right. And now, you are the one who must answer for your actions." The sheriff's eyes narrowed, but he didn't back down. "You think you can stand against us? You think these warriors will protect you?" He glanced over his shoulder at the group of deputies behind him, who were now forming a loose circle around the warriors. "You are making a grave mistake, Sarah." Dakota stepped forward, his presence commanding. "You will not threaten us," he said, his voice calm but fierce. "We are not here to cause harm, but we will not be driven out. We will not be made to feel less than." The sheriff scoffed, his eyes flicking to the warriors standing at the edges of the clearing. "You think you can win this fight?" he sneered. "You're outnumbered, and you'll never have the support of the people." Sarah could feel the tension in the air, thick and oppressive. This was no longer just about her, or the boy she had protected. This was about the entire Apache community and their fight for survival. "We don't need the support of those who don't understand us," Dakota said. "We only need the strength to stand tall and fight for what's right." The sheriff stepped back, his hand resting on his gun. For a moment, the two sides stared at each other, the tension thick enough to cut through. But then, with a grim look in his eyes, the sheriff turned and motioned for his men to leave. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low. "We'll be back, and when we do, we'll make sure you understand who runs this town." As the riders disappeared into the distance, Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. But she knew this was just the beginning. The battle for justice was far from over. The Apache warriors had made their stand, and Sarah had made hers. And together, they would face whatever came next. The days that followed the sheriff's retreat were filled with unease and anticipation. Sarah stood by the window of her small cabin, watching the Apache warriors as they moved silently around their camp. The air was thick with tension, the kind that only came when a storm was brewing. The warriors had not moved from their positions since the sheriff left, but Sarah could feel the weight of the battle to come hanging over them all. The quiet, yet steady presence of Dakota, the leader of the warriors, gave her a sense of resolve, but even he seemed to be lost in thought, his eyes often scanning the horizon. Sarah knew the town was watching. The sheriff had made it clear that they would return, and with them, a new wave of aggression. She couldn't escape the feeling that the next time they came, it would not be a simple confrontation. It would be a battle. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Dakota approached Sarah's cabin. His movements were deliberate, his face as unreadable as always. But tonight, there was something different in his eyes, an urgency, a fire that had not been there before. "Sarah," he began, his voice low but clear, "we need to prepare. The sheriff and his men will be back soon, and they will not come in peace." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "How soon?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dakota glanced at the warriors gathered around their campfire, the flickering flames, casting shadows over their faces. "I do not know, but it will be soon. They are not the only ones who are watching. Word has spread about what has happened here, and there are others who may see it as an opportunity to act. We cannot afford to wait any longer." Sarah nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. The town, the sheriff, they were all part of a system that had long been built on fear and oppression. But now, she and the Apache warriors had become part of something greater, a fight for justice, for equality. She had made her choice, and she would stand by it, no matter the cost. The following morning, Sarah woke early, her mind racing with the events to come. As she stepped outside, the fresh morning air filled her lungs, but the beauty of the day did little to ease the knot of anxiety in her stomach. Dakota and the warriors had begun to prepare, their movements quick and purposeful. Sarah had learned much from them over the past few days, their ways of surviving and fighting rooted in honor and respect. She knew that the warriors would not fight unless they had to, but she also knew they were ready for whatever came their way. The town, on the other hand, was a different story. The sheriff's threat had sparked something deep within the people of Ridgewood, and while some had already begun to gather behind Sarah, others were still hesitant, afraid of the change that was coming. Sarah couldn't blame them. Change was never easy, especially when it meant standing up to an established system. As the day wore on, Sarah found herself standing at the edge of the clearing, watching as the warriors made their final preparations. They were calm, almost eerily so, but their readiness was clear. Dakota approached her again, this time with a quiet smile on his face. "We are ready," he said simply. Sarah nodded, feeling a surge of strength fill her chest. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She was no longer alone. She had allies now. Allies who understood the importance of standing up for what was right, no matter the consequences. That afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, the first signs of the approaching riders became visible on the horizon. Sarah's heart pounded. In her chest, as she stepped forward, her hand instinctively reaching for the small knife she kept by her side. Dakota and the warriors stood by her, their eyes trained on the approaching group. This time, there were more riders, a larger group of men dressed in dark uniforms, their horses kicking up dust as they rode toward the cabin. Sarah knew that this was it, the moment they had all been waiting for. She had no illusions about what was to come. There would be no easy resolution, no peaceful compromise. This was a fight for justice, for survival. The sheriff's men rode in, their faces grim, their eyes scanning the warriors with suspicion. But they did not make any immediate move. It was as if they were waiting for something to happen, waiting for Sarah to make the first move. She didn't give them the satisfaction. She stood tall, her back straight, her eyes unwavering. Dakota stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "This is our land, our people. We will not be pushed out." The sheriff's men shifted uneasily, clearly not expecting such resistance. "You think you can stand against us?" one of them sneered. "You think you can win this fight?" Dakota's gaze never wavered. "This is not a fight we want," he said, his voice steady. "But if you force us, we will defend ourselves." Sarah felt the tension rise in the air, the quiet before the storm. The sheriff's men looked to each other, their hands twitching near their weapons. But they did not draw them. Not yet. Leave now, Sarah said, her voice strong. Leave this place, and we will not harm you. But if you stay, if you threaten us again, you will not leave here in peace. The sheriff's men hesitated, their eyes flicking between Sarah and the warriors. The silence stretched on, thick with tension, but in the end, it was the sheriff who spoke. This isn't over, he said, his voice low and dangerous. We'll be back. And with that, the riders turned, retreating into the distance, leaving Sarah and the warriors standing in the clearing, the weight of what had just transpired hanging heavy in the air. It was a victory, but it was only the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over, and Sarah knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. But she was ready. They were all ready. The days following the sheriff's retreat felt heavy, as though the calm before the storm was suffocating the town of Ridgewood. Sarah stood at the edge of her porch, gazing at the horizon, watching the winds ripple through the dry grass of the plains. The Apache warriors had kept their vigil, a constant presence in the clearing, watching, waiting. They hadn't moved much, but Sarah could feel the quiet anticipation in the air. It was only a matter of time before the sheriff and his men returned, but this time, Sarah knew they would be ready. Dakota, the leader of the warriors, had been a silent companion through the days of waiting. His calm presence gave her strength, but even he could not hide the quiet determination in his eyes. Sarah knew he was preparing for something much bigger. She had heard the murmurs around town. The people were nervous, unsure of what would happen next. The sheriff's retreat had not been a defeat for the authorities. It had been a pause, a momentary step back before they tried again. That evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple, Sarah met Dakota by the fire. "We are ready," he said, his voice steady and full of conviction. "But it is not just them we will face." Sarah raised an eyebrow, the weight of his words settling on her shoulders. "What do you mean?" she asked. Dakota's eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw something flicker. Was it hope? Or was it the weariness of a leader who had seen too much war? "There are others," he said softly. "Others who will come to challenge us. The sheriff is not working alone." Sarah felt a chill creep up her spine. The truth of the matter was, the conflict was no longer just between Ridgewood and the Apache warriors. It was about something deeper. It was about power, control, and the future of Ridgewood itself. As the night grew darker, Sarah could hear the distant sound of hooves, a faint echo on the wind. She turned to see a figure approaching the camp. It was a rider, alone, a figure wrapped in a long, dark coat. The figure stopped at the edge of the campfire's light, and Sarah saw the familiar face of the sheriff. He had returned. "I warned you," the sheriff said, his voice cold and unwavering as he dismounted. "You've made your stand, but it will cost you." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had known this moment would come, but it didn't make it any easier. She stood tall, facing the sheriff, not allowing her fear to show. "I won't back down," she said, her voice strong and defiant. "This is the right thing to do. You're not the law here. You're just the enforcer of injustice." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "You have no idea what you're up against," he growled, a dangerous edge creeping into his voice. "These people, these warriors, they've come to destroy everything we've built. And you're standing in the way of that." Dakota stepped forward, his tall frame casting a shadow over Sarah. "We are not here to destroy. We are here to protect," he said, his voice calm but powerful. "We are not your enemy." The sheriff hesitated, his gaze flicking from Sarah to Dakota, and then back to Sarah. "You think you can stand against us?" he asked, his voice dripping with contempt. "You've made a dangerous choice, Sarah." Sarah's resolve hardened. "I've made the only choice I could," she said. "You've hurt too many people. You've pushed too many to the edge. And now it's time to face the consequences." The sheriff looked at her, his hand resting on the handle of his gun. But before he could respond, another rider appeared from the shadows. This time, it wasn't the sheriff's men, it was another group of Apache warriors, led by a young man Sarah had not yet met. He rode with confidence, his eyes full of fire and determination. "We have come," he said, his voice strong. "We will fight for what is ours, and we will not be driven out." The young warrior dismounted, his eyes meeting Dakota's in a silent exchange of respect. Sarah could feel the shift in the air, the change in momentum. The warriors were ready. And now, it seemed, The battle was inevitable. The sheriff, seeing the gathering force before him, slowly stepped back, his face twisted with anger. "This isn't over," he said, his voice shaking with fury. "We will return with more men. You cannot win." Takoda stood tall, his expression unwavering. "We do not seek war," he said. "But if it is forced upon us, we will defend ourselves." With that, the sheriff and his men turned, riding off into the distance, their departure leaving an uneasy silence in its wake. Sarah watched them go, her heart racing with anticipation. She had stood her ground, but she knew the hardest part was yet to come. The battle was not over. It had only just begun. The night after the sheriff's retreat, Ridgewood was filled with uneasy silence. Sarah stood on the porch of her cabin, her heart heavy as she looked at the stars above. Takoda and the other warriors were scattered around their camp, their faces reflecting the flickering firelight. They had already prepared for what was coming. Sarah knew that the moment of confrontation was closer than ever, but she didn't know how much longer they could hold out. Despite the standoff, she felt a strange sense of resolve settle within her. She had made her choice, and there was no turning back now. The morning arrived with the same stillness, but there was a weight in the air that felt different from before. It wasn't just the promise of a coming storm. It was the realization that their actions had reached a tipping point. Ridgewood's future was hanging in the balance, and Sarah wasn't sure which direction it would fall. She heard the sound of horses' hooves from the distance and quickly stepped outside. Takoda was already there, watching the horizon. "They are coming," he said quietly, his voice steady as ever. "We will meet them on our terms, not theirs." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. The time had arrived. The sheriff's men were returning, but this time, they were bringing reinforcements. There was no doubt in Sarah's mind that this would not be a peaceful resolution. She couldn't help but feel a sense of pride mixed with fear. The warriors had become her family, and she had become part of something much bigger than herself. Takoda's voice interrupted her thoughts. "We will face them together. Do not fear." Sarah nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "I'm not afraid of them. I'm afraid of what will happen to all of you if this goes wrong." Takoda placed a hand on her shoulder. "We are prepared. We will fight for what is right." As the first riders came into view, Sarah could see the fear and uncertainty in their eyes. They were determined, but so were the warriors. The sheriff, leading the group, glared at Sarah from his position. "You've caused enough trouble, Sarah," he spat, his voice filled with venom. "You forced my hand. Now you'll regret it." Sarah's heart pounded, but she stood tall. "You may think you're in control, but you're wrong. The people you've oppressed for so long are no longer afraid to stand up to you." The sheriff's eyes narrowed, his fingers brushing against the handle of his gun. "This is your final warning," he growled. "You'll all pay for this rebellion. You think these people will protect you? You're making a terrible mistake." Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't take her eyes off the sheriff as she spoke. "No, Sheriff. You're the one who's made a mistake. These people aren't rebels. They are protecting their land, their people, their future, and I will stand with them." Takoda stepped forward, his tall frame casting a shadow over the sheriff. "This is our land, our home," Takoda said, his voice deep and powerful. "We will not be moved. We will not be silenced." The sheriff hesitated, his hand still hovering over his gun, but he didn't make a move. The warriors stood firm, silent but ready. The tension in the air was thick, but Sarah knew that if this was going to be resolved, it would take more than just words. The sheriff spoke again, his voice edged with frustration. "You think you can win this fight? You're outnumbered. There's no way you can stand against us. We will destroy you all." Sarah felt her chest tighten, but she didn't let fear take hold. She glanced at the warriors beside her, each one ready to stand and fight. They weren't afraid of the sheriff's men. They had been fighting for their survival for far too long to back down now. "I think you're the one who's outnumbered," Sarah said, her voice steady. "We may be fewer, but we are stronger than you know. We fight for what's right, and that's something you will never understand." The sheriff looked at her, his eyes full of rage, but he said nothing. The tension reached a boiling point, and for a long moment, no one moved. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, unsure of what would come next. But just as the situation seemed to reach its peak, something shifted in the air. One of the warriors, a young man Sarah had seen only briefly before, stepped forward. His voice rang out, clear and strong. "We are not here for bloodshed. We are here for peace, but we will not back down. The sheriff's men looked at each other, unsure of how to respond. They had expected fear, resistance, but they had not expected this calm, unwavering strength. The warriors, despite being outnumbered, stood their ground, united and resolute. "You may have the numbers," Takoda said, his voice quiet but commanding. "But we have the will to fight for our future. You cannot take that from us." The sheriff's eyes darted around, calculating his next move. But the warriors had already made their decision. There was no more room for negotiation. The fight for justice had begun, and it would not end until they had secured their place in this world. As the sheriff turned to leave, his face twisted with defeat, Sarah felt a sense of victory that she hadn't expected. They had won this round, but the battle was far from over. The warriors had proven that they were not just a group to be feared, but a force to be reckoned with. And Sarah knew that this was just the beginning of a long and difficult fight. But she also knew that she would not face it alone. The warriors were her allies, and together, they would forge a new future, one built on justice, respect, and strength. As the days passed after the sheriff's retreat, the tension in Ridgewood grew thick. The quiet victory Sarah and the Apache warriors had won was only temporary, and they all knew it. The warriors continued to stand vigil, their presence unwavering, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was still ahead. The town had shifted, its people divided between those who saw the Apache as enemies and those who, like Sarah, believed in the justice of their cause. Despite the fear that lingered in the air, Sarah found herself more determined than ever. She had chosen this path, and she would see it through, no matter the cost. Takoda, as always, stood by her side. The two of them had become a team, their bond strengthened by the trials they had already faced. Sarah had seen the way Takoda led his people, with wisdom, strength, and an unwavering commitment to his values. It was a leadership she had come to trust and respect. Yet, even Takoda could not hide the burden of what was to come. As the days grew longer and the tension reached a boiling point, Sarah could feel the eyes of the town on her. The sheriff's men would return, that much was certain. The question was when. And when they did, Sarah knew the Apache would not back down. One morning, as the sun rose over the hills, casting a golden light across the land, Sarah stood on her porch, watching the warriors prepare for whatever came next. Takoda approached, his steps steady and sure. "It's time," he said quietly. Sarah looked up at him, her heart heavy. "We're ready," she said. Takoda nodded. "They will come, but we will be here, and we will stand." That was all that needed to be said. The decision had been made. As the day wore on, the sound of hooves once again reached Sarah's ears. This time, there were more riders. The sheriff had returned, but he wasn't alone. A larger group of men, armed and ready for conflict, followed him. Sarah's heart pounded as she turned to the warriors. They were ready. She could see it in their eyes. Takoda stepped forward, his gaze meeting hers. "We will stand for what is right," he said. Sarah nodded, her resolve strengthening. "We will stand together." The riders came to a halt at the edge of the clearing. The sheriff, his face hard and determined, stepped forward. "This is the last time, Sarah," he said, his voice cold. "You've forced my hand, and now you will face the consequences." Sarah stepped forward to meet him, her back straight and her head held high. "You've been given every chance to do the right thing, Sheriff. But you chose to follow a path of fear and violence. That is not the path of justice." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "You think you can lecture me on justice? You've already made your choice. You chose the Apache over your own people." "No," Sarah said, her voice firm. "I chose what's right, and I won't back down." Takoda stepped beside her, his presence steady and unyielding. "This is our land, and we will not be driven out." The sheriff's men shifted uneasily, but the sheriff stood his ground, his hand resting on his gun. Sarah could see the anger in his eyes, but there was something else too, fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of losing control. "You've made your last mistake, Sarah," he said, his voice shaking with rage. But Takoda was calm, his voice a quiet promise. "We do not seek violence, but we will defend ourselves, and we will protect our people." The sheriff hesitated, his eyes darting between Sarah, Takoda, and the warriors who stood like an unmovable wall. He knew that if this escalated, there would be no turning back. "This isn't over," the sheriff muttered, before turning and signaling to his men. The riders mounted their horses and began to leave, but the sense of finality hung in the air. Sarah watched them go, feeling the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. The battle wasn't over, but this was a victory. For now, the Apache were safe. The warriors stood tall, but there was no joy in their victory. They knew that the sheriff's retreat was only temporary. Sarah turned to Dakota, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and fear. "What now?" she asked quietly. Dakota met her gaze, his expression calm. "Now we wait. And when the time comes, we will be ready." Sarah nodded. The road ahead was uncertain, but she knew that no matter what, they would face it together. As the sun set on the quiet town of Ridgewood, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight for justice was far from over, but with the warriors by her side, she knew they could face anything. The world was changing, and Sarah would stand at the forefront of that change, no matter the cost.